Hi, let me tell you a little bit about why we have the North Houston Space Society. Let's start with an analogy. First of all, what's this? Of course, it's a cube of ice, but do you know how cold it is? Well, it could be 0 degrees, it could be negative 10 degrees Celsius, it could be negative 30 degrees Celsius. And what you see there is like air bubbles inside the ice. So don't think the ice is melting. And what's this? This is a glass of water. And of course, we know that at normal atmosphere, its temperature must be somewhere between 0 and 100 degrees Celsius. And here, of course, is that water boiling and transforming into vapor. And what I want to do is use this as an analogy to talk about transformation, radical transformation. Because if you kind of look at how the ice cube becomes the water and the water becomes boiling and turning into gas, there's two key temperatures that you have to be concerned about at normal atmospheric pressure. 0 degrees is, of course, the melting or freezing point, and then 100 degrees Celsius is, of course, the boiling or condensation point of water. And if you look at something less than 0 degrees Celsius, it doesn't matter how cold you get it, you're still going to have a block of ice, it's going to be solid. And if you look at between 0 to 100 degrees Celsius, it's going to be liquid. And I would argue that these are not so interesting to look at least not at a macroscopic level when you're just using your eyes to take a look at it. However, here at 0 degrees Celsius, we see a radical transformation. This solid piece of ice that may have been negative 50 degrees, and you've heated it, you know, by 10 degrees, and then by another 10 degrees, and by another 10 degrees, and nothing's changed. And then finally, you get up to that 0 degrees Celsius mark, and boom, this solid block of ice is turned to water. Radical transformation. And the same thing you can see at 100 degrees Celsius. This water, of course, is boiling is perfectly 100 degrees Celsius, and then it eventually all boil out, and the vapor will be what the vapor is. But the same thing could apply to human technology. Consider flight. Back in 1903, we had the first heavier than air flight with the Wright brothers. And then in 1933, we had the first commercial airline craft actually fly, the Boeing 247. And then in 1969, we had the Boeing 747. Now, what's interesting is sort of the stark difference between the Wright Flyer craft and the Boeing 247. But a lot of similarities between the Boeing 247 and the Boeing 747. I mean, the idea of the passenger being inside of the cabin, that the engines mounted on the wings, kind of like the placement of the wings. Of course, they're different shape, but it's probably a lot easier to imagine the Boeing 747 after seeing the Boeing 247 than it is to imagine the Boeing 247 after looking at the Wright brothers airplane. But, as a thought experiment, just imagine what people were thinking and talking about around these different sort of developments. Before 1903, what did they probably say? They probably said heavier than air flight's impossible. I imagine that was the general perception. And then once the Wright brothers actually started flying, sure, it's possible, but what's the point? One highly trained individual in a very shaky aircraft taking flights that is measured in seconds or minutes. And then, of course, by the time you got the Boeing 247 coming along, they're like, okay, maybe you do have a point. Maybe there is something to this aircraft after all. But probably the sentiment at the time was, I think I'll keep my feet on the ground in my train, in my car, in my boat. And then, I would imagine that maybe in 1969, people are like, hey, let's get on the plane and let's go. Now, space flight. Well, before moving on, I think if you were to talk to people, kind of this time period between 1903 and 1933, when people had evidence in hand that heavier than air flight was possible, but it hadn't quite taken the form that's ubiquitous today. I think that would have been a good time to engage with the public and ask them, what do you think the future of aviation would be? Where they're kind of unconstrained by reality. where their decisions haven't been informed by multiple trips to the airport and taking long flights. Well, let's talk about space for a little bit. So 1957, the very first object to orbit the Earth, Sputnik. And then just a few months later, the very first living thing to orbit the Earth, the dog Laika, Sputnik 2. And then, of course, 1961, Yuri did his flight, the very first man to go around the Earth. And in 1969, same year as that Boeing 747, we also landed on the moon. And then 1971, the very first space station was Salyut 1. And 1972, Apollo 17 was the last time that we went to the moon. Isn't that amazing? We made such great progress here, and then 1972, we stopped going to the moon. But in 1975, we had the first docking of two spacecraft from different countries with the Soyuz Apollo. And then, of course, 1981, Space Shuttle's first flight. And then 1998, the ISS begins. And at the time of the last shuttle flight in 2011, this is what the ISS looked like. Quite a big development and a remarkable achievement in international cooperation. And of course, since then, we've had many different milestones, and there's like so much that I could include, but I would say being able to reuse the first stage of these orbital class rockets as demonstrated with the first recovery at landing of one in 2016. And then of course, just last month in April of 2023, we had the first integrated Starship flight. These are kind of the time periods that we're interested in. And I believe that what we're seeing is sort of we're about to enter into one of these periods of radical transformation when the solid ice turns into liquid or the liquid ice turns into vapor. And if you just look at the moon, just consider the missions to the moon right now. I mean, if you look at all the missions that are planned as of right now, including crewed missions, some, of course, by NASA and some by private companies and some by China, lots of planned moon missions out there. I believe that the 2020s are going to be one of these big inflections, points. And as such, I think it'd be really interesting to find out what people think about it. Sort of like that period that was mentioned between the Wright Flyer and that first Boeing passenger aircraft. And so I started this project in 2019, and I got an article about it published in the 2020, for my 1-year anniversary. I've been going around asking people what they think about us going back to the moon, or even did they even know about it. And I've done this since 2019. And just to give you an idea of the types of questions I ask now, each conversation is kind of unique, but I've kind of sort of centered around these 4 conversations. First of all, did you know that we're going back? What do you think about it? And where do you see humanity going? And if you could, would you take a trip to space? And just to give you an idea on the scope and scale of this project, this countdown to the moon, which I should say is really, countdown to the end of 2024, which is when we were going to have people on the moon when I first started the project. So on December 17th, 2019, I started the project with 1,840 days till the end of 2024. And I interviewed my niece, Pooja, as the very first person. And since then, I've interviewed people at yoga class and people that just happened to be going up and down the elevator, up the elevator at the hotel that I was staying in York, UK. And, back whenever COVID was just getting started in March of 2020, I had this rule that all my interviews needed to be done in person. And I couldn't really interview in person whenever we were doing the COVID lockdowns, but I thought I'd record it on my phone and have them on the computer like in person. It's really a goofy month for me, but it worked. And then finally, succumbed to using Zoom and started having Zoom meetings. And then, of course, eventually by the end of 2020, we were seeing each other, but still having to wear face masks. And then whenever I went to Mexico at the end of 2021, I interviewed people there. As well as here, I got to interview Keith Mansfield in front of the ISS sculpture at the Tate Modern in London. And of course, I interviewed John over there at Wimbledon. And then my neighbors who were just putting up Christmas tree lights, and you can see a fisherman are some of my favorite people to interview, as well as I interviewed my eye doctor, and then just somebody at La Madeleine, and then just random people. Even I interviewed people in character at the Japanese festival, and then the interview I did yesterday over at work. So I've been interviewing a lot of people, and I've been getting a wide perspective on what people are thinking about humanity and humanity's future. So I guess, first of all, did you know that we were sending people back to the moon? Now, out of all the people that you know, what do you think is the percentage of people that know that we're going back to the moon? Well, in my experience, it's somewhere between 10 to 20%. 1 out of every 10 to 1 out of every 5 people that I just randomly talk to know. Some even have gone so far as thinking that NASA shut down the last shuttle flight in 2011. Very few people, admittedly, and then some think that NASA are going for the first time. Maybe about maybe half a dozen of all the people, and some think we never stop going, even fewer people. What do you think about us going back to the moon? Some people are very excited. It's our future. It's about time. We should have never left. I even heard one person say, the government wastes so much money. At least they should spend some of it doing something inspirational. But other people have questions. What is the purpose? Why are we going back to the moon? Back during the Apollo era is so easy to talk about, to beat the Russians. We have to beat the Russians. But now we're going back for like 20, 30, 40 different reasons. And none of them really, grab hold of people's imagination. So it's really difficult to talk about. There's plenty of reasons for us to go back, but they're all reasons that don't hold up the effort entirely, and they're not the entire focus of the effort. It was not as clear of a story as we've got to beat the Russians. So, it makes sense that these questions remain. Some say, haven't we done that before? Of course, I would ask, people who visit Disney World for the second time, haven't you done that before too? Obviously, the moon's a big, vast place, and we only landed on 6 different spots, and we did very little exploration at those 6 spots. There's a lot about the moon that we still have left to discover. And then, of course, people say we should spend our resources on other things. They talk about global climate change and poverty and infrastructure on Earth. And I think these people really have an outsized view of how much we actually spend on NASA. I mean, we spend something like more than 20 times of what we spend on NASA on the military. And the NASA budget is less than 0.5% of the US budget. So, given everything else that we're doing is actually very small. And the human spaceflight program part of that is actually only half of that. The rest of it's kind of these robotic missions that we do. Some have even said we messed up the Earth, we shouldn't mess up the moon too. And some think we will eventually use up this planet and need someplace else to go. So these are sort of different views that people have about us going back to the moon. Now, where do you see humanity in 500 years? That's where I started out with. And lately I've been asking people about 200 years. Some are very positive and think we'll make it to the next star system, or at least to Moon, Mars, and other places. Some think we'll still be here on Earth. And unfortunately, there is a surprisingly large number of people who think we won't be here at all. And when you start asking about the reason, they'll point to nuclear war or some type of predicted end to the world that's just impossible to avoid, or global climate change, or IA takes over, or we've used up this planet and we need to move on. And something that humanity is maybe going through its teenage years now and will finally grow up, and the best things are in our future. And if you could take a trip to space, of course, I got a lot of no's. I got yes, but after it's proven, of course, I got some yeses. And my all-time favorite, how do you beat that? Yes, even if I had to be abducted by aliens to do it. So the North Houston Space Society. So coming back here, We want to help people answer those questions to understand why it's important for us to go back to the moon and have a spacefaring civilization. We want people to know that humanity can have a positive, expansive, unending future, that humanity has something good to offer to the universe. We're not perfect. There are a lot of things that we could point to that were less than good, but I would say that life is good. And being the only life on this planet that can actually transport and protect other life on this planet, I think we have a duty to spread the life on this planet to the rest of the universe. Life is good. Living things are good. We should expand, and we should really turn this whole planetary protection thing on its head. And we should have, facilities on other places in the solar system that have full biospheres, and that we try to preserve as much of the life that we have on this planet as possible. Seed banks throughout the solar system. And also, if you're interested in finding out what's out there, I mean, the universe is so mind-bogglingly vast. There is so much to it. I would say, first of all, you're not alone. There are other people like you. You may not come in contact them on a daily basis. You may not see them on the news. You may not see them on your Twitter feed, but you are not alone. There are people who believe in a positive future for humanity and that they feel the responsibility to play a part in it. And I would say that the North Houston Space Society is the right place for you if you're in North Houston. So join us. Visit our website, northhoustonspace.org. And with that, I thank you so much for your time.